Thank you all so much for joining us today for the latest installment in our Champions of Equality series. This series features conversations with activists, academics, educators on topics related to the historical fight for gender equality. Before we begin, I would like you all to join me for our land acknowledgement. The land upon which we gather is part of the traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape called the Lenapehoking. The Lenape people lived in harmony with one another upon this territory for thousands of years. During the colonial era and early federal period, many were removed west and north, but some also remained among the continuing historical tribal communities of this region. The Nanticoke Lenni Lenape Tribal Nation, the Ramapo Lenape Nation, and the Powhatan Lenape Nation, the Nanticoke of Millsboro, Delaware, and Lenape of Cheswold, Delaware. We acknowledge the Lenni Lenape as the original people of this land and their continuing relationship with their territory. In our acknowledgement of the continued presence of Lenape people in their homeland, we affirm the aspiration of the great Lenape chief, Temenenend, that there may be harmony between the indigenous people of this land and the descendants of the immigrants to this land, as long as the rivers and creeks flow and the sun, moon, and stars shine. Before I introduce our guest today, I just want to remind everyone that we invite you to share your questions during the Q&A portion at the end of our program. We are dedicated to making all of our spaces, virtual and otherwise, safe and inclusive for everyone. That means that harassment of any kind will not be tolerated in verbal or written comments during APC programs. If anyone chooses to engage in racist, sexist, transphobic, or homophobic speech, or any kind of harassment or bullying behavior, they will be removed from the program without further warning. I don't think that's going to happen tonight, but I have to read that. Anyway, thank you all so much for being a part of our community and for partnering with us to make sure we remain dedicated to equality for all word and in deed. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest, Dina Castillo, the Healthy Relationships Coordinator and Kaleidoscope Advocate at the Pride Center at the Center for Family Services, joining us today as a champion of equality to talk about violence prevention in the LGBTQ community. So, Dina, the floor is yours.
Cool. I like the sound of that. I'm a champion of equality. I
In a
feel
sweet
good
way.
about that. Okay, so hold on. Let's see here. Can you see that okay? I don't know. There we go. Cool. So, hello everyone. Like Molly mentioned, my name is Dina Castillo, and I essentially run the Training Institute at the Pride Center. So I have the amazing opportunity to be able to go out into the community and work with a really wide range of audiences. So I provide trainings on LGBTQ plus 101 terminology, best practices, effective allyship, and a big piece of it is really violence prevention, which is where the focus is going to be today. But it's a really, really fun job. I love what I do. I love to be able to share information. And that being said, I don't know everything, right? And so your input, your information is just as valuable as mine. So I want this to, I always want to welcome the opportunity to share what you know, because it's really, really important to really come together with our resources and build out a network of knowledge and of community. So, and I'll talk some more about some of the resources that we offer at Center for Family Services Pride Center. But obviously I'll start with the Training Institute, being that this is why we're here. So if you're not too familiar with the agency, we have so many programs. It's a massive agency and it is considered statewide. So we do have programs in every county in New Jersey. Obviously, there are different funding streams that have different requirements and catchment areas. So just feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about different service clusters that you see here on the screen, and I'd be more than happy to connect you with that particular department. So as a little overview of what we're going to talk about today, we're talking about intimate partner violence, but also domestic violence at the end. So when we talk about intimate partner violence, I definitely want to first review the power and control wheel very briefly. If you've not heard of it before, I'm happy to introduce it to you. But after we go over the power and control wheel, I definitely want to talk about intimate partner violence in queer relationships. So what are some unique considerations that we need to make when we're thinking about intimate partner violence and unhealthy relationships in queer context, prevalence rates, unique tactics that you might be seeing in queer context that you might not be seeing as often or sometimes at all in cisgendered heterosexual contexts, and some barriers that queer victim survivors might be facing. And of course, I'm going to close out with some resources. So now, I used to just do this training without doing like a 101 at like terminology. So I'm hoping you got a chance to see the first installment that we did here. If not, I'm pretty sure you can find the recording somewhere. So feel free to watch that and then watch this. But if you did attend and you do have questions about terms that I use throughout, please just feel free to ask me and I'd be more than happy to clarify anything. All right, so let's start with talking about intimate partner violence. Now, there's lots of different definitions out there. I actually took a 60-hour domestic violence response team training through Unity in Mercer County. And we talked about all the different unique perspectives to intimate partner violence and abuse. But this particular definition is provided to us by the World Health Organization. It's behaviors within an intimate relationship that cause physical, sexual, or psychological harm, including acts of physical aggression, sexual coercion, psychological abuse, and controlling behaviors. So really, really broad there. And a way that we can conceptualize intimate partner violence or domestic violence or other forms of abuse is through the power and control wheel. So this particular model was created in Duluth, Minnesota in the early 1980s, basically through focus groups of victim survivors. And they kind of got together to discuss the different tactics their abusers used to gain power and control over them. Now, a couple things I want you to notice about this wheel, and that's that the center of abuse is power and control, not the individual tactics themselves, right? So essentially what that means is that the tactics themselves is not what constitute abuse. Abuse is essentially one individual having complete power and control over another individual or individuals. The tactics are simply how you arrive there, right? It's a way for an abuser to gain power and control and then maintain power and control. And all of that, right? And look, by the end of this training, you're definitely going to have power and control, those two words stuck in your head. But that opens the floodgates to physical and sexual violence. Now, the other thing I'll have you notice as you take a look at this is most of these tactics on the wheel don't really require laying a finger on anyone. So I bring that up because a lot of times when we offer these healthy relationships trainings in high schools and we work with youth and teens and even young adults, we ask them, right, what takes an unhealthy relationship to become an abusive relationship? Where's that line? And more often than not, we get, if there's physical violence. But again, just want to point out here that there are other means of gaining power and control. And most of them don't really require physical violence. All right, so with that being said, I want to talk about intimate partner violence in LGBTQ plus relationships. So there is a misconception that intimate partner violence doesn't happen as often in queer relationships, and that's really far from the truth. So these are lifetime prevalence rates of rape, physical violence, and or stalking by an intimate partner. And as you can see here, these dark blue percentages, the ones associated with queer identities, are generally higher than heterosexual men and heterosexual women. Now, a couple things to point out about this. So this is obviously from the CDC's National Intimate Partner Violence and Sexual Violence Survey. And this report is from 2017, I believe. And you can see here, there isn't really tons of variation in terms of what identities are included in this study, right? In terms of sexual orientation, you have gay, lesbian, and bisexual. And we know that there are many, many more sexual orientations outside of those three identities. And with regard to gender, we only have men and women included, right? So we're not seeing non-binary folks included in this study. We're not seeing transgender individuals, who are definitely the most vulnerable when it comes to violence in the community. So just something to keep in mind there, in terms of who's included in a study, and therefore who we have information on. And we know statistics and research and information is pretty much the driving force behind the creation of tons of resources. And without those statistics, without that data, we don't really have, well, we're losing out on opportunities to create resources, right? So just something to think about. The other thing I'll mention is underreporting. So across every single population, you're going to see underreporting, right? Not every single individual who experiences some form of violence is going to report it somewhere. So with that being said, though, when you take a look at marginalized communities, underreporting is happening at higher rates. And we'll talk about why in just a second. But that may mean the gap between these identities here, the gap of percentages might actually be larger than what we see because of underreporting. All right. I also wanted to share the percentage of youth experiencing sexual dating violence. So as you can see, non-LGBTQ white youth make up 6% of that population. And that's higher than zero, right? So we absolutely need to continue doing the work to get that number from 6 to 0%. And it's important to note that if you are LGBTQ identifying, if you identify with one of these other categories that you see here pictured on the screen, unfortunately, it means prevalence rates of dating violence really skyrocket, right? And so unfortunately, there's almost this hypervigilance that we need to kind of carry as people that belong to these categories. And as service providers also kind of having that mentality. Now, that's not to say, when I work with service providers, I'm like, no, I don't want you to think that if somebody's queer and they say they're in a relationship, that you have to assume that it's an unhealthy one or an abusive one. Absolutely not. It's just to say, really being tuned into risk factors, protective factors, preventative factors, right? Just being aware of that dynamic and being aware of what the unique considerations are. But there are plenty of queer folks, people of color, that are in very loving, committed relationships. So I don't want to send the wrong message there. But there are absolutely more risk factors as you enter into that realm. Some people love data, some people hate data. We're almost through with the setting up the context. So bear with me if you hate numbers, but it's important and it kind of sets the tone. So stick with me here. But I want to share some information from the CDC's Youth Risk Behavior Report. This lasted 10 years, so from 2009 to 2019, and they took a look at different high school aged populations. And what they found was 13% of lesbian, gay, or bisexual high school age students experienced some form of physical dating violence, and 16% experienced some form of sexual dating violence. Now, they compared this to heterosexual high school age students in the same brackets, and that number drops to 7% in each category, right? So that's the first disparity that we're seeing here. Now, shockingly, and this is a pleasant surprise, they actually included trans folks in this survey. And here they found that 26% of trans high school age students experienced a form of physical dating violence, and 23% experienced a form of sexual dating violence. Again, they compared this to cisgendered high school age students in that same bracket, or non-trans individuals, and that number drops to 15% and 16% in each respective category. So again, we're definitely noticing a disparity here. And And I point that out not because I'm saying we need to disregard or kind of minimize dating violence that we're seeing in cisgendered heterosexual relationships. No, absolutely not. Like, we absolutely still need to be paying attention to those cohort of the population. But it's just to say, look, the outreach that we're doing, the education that we're providing, the resources that we have set up are not reaching a section of the population that are really impacted by dating violence, right? So it's just to say, how can we become more creative and more effective in our outreach to this population, right? Because we're definitely seeing a disparity there. I also wanted to bring up this report here. It's a national LGBTQ plus survey, and it's for folks over the age of 18 that are LGBTQ identifying, that identify as women. So actually, the caveat here is that they it's included people who have identified as a woman in the past or who currently do. So that means that kind of opens up the kind of different identities that are included. So that means they're inclusive of non-binary folks who were assigned female at birth, trans folks, gender fluid, gender queer. And actually, if you pull up the report, you can look all the way at the bottom to see the incredible list of gender identities included in the study. So that's really, really great to see. And it's actually called "We Never Give Up the Fight," because at the very end of the survey, they ask the respondent, is there anything you'd like to say about what you love about your community or what you love about your queerness? And somebody's response was, "We never give up the fight." And they loved that so much, they actually made it the name of the report, which I thought was really, really cool. But in any case, 47% of respondents had experienced some form of intimate partner violence. So it's inclusive of emotional, physical, and/or sexual dating violence. And more than 33% reported family members drawing on childhood faith traditions or religious doctrine to justify verbal or emotional abuse against them. And what I want to highlight here is the justification of abuse. And when we talk about domestic violence towards the end of the presentation here, that's going to play a role, right? So the justification of abuse is definitely something that we see a lot in queer spaces, especially when you take a look at queer family rejection, for example. And it's really, really, it creates challenges because now you have the victim survivor not really sure if what they're experiencing is abuse to begin with. They're sat here kind of questioning what their identity means for the relationship they share with family members or close friends. And importantly, and really, really unfortunately, it shrinks the number of trusted people they can go to without fearing further justification of abuse. So again, we're going to talk in a little bit more detail of the link to family rejection in just a bit here, but I definitely wanted to highlight that. And lastly, only 20% sought some kind of institutional support for experiencing emotional or physical violence. Now, it's a low number, but it's not surprising, unfortunately. And again, we're going to talk more about the barriers and why queer victim survivors are more hesitant to reach out to for resources and for some kind of institutional support. So before we jump into that, I want to highlight some unique tactics that you might see, at least see more often in LGBTQ plus relationships. So, and I get the question a lot, why are we seeing more, higher prevalence rates of abuse in queer spaces? And, a lot of times people can jump to the inference that queer people are simply more violent, right? And that's not the case. What we're seeing here is, obviously we can chalk this up to the lack of institutional support. There's obviously a link between higher risk factors within marginalized communities. There aren't as many robust resources and services and education in these spaces, right? Like all of that contributes to this. And you essentially have this unfortunate expanded arsenal if you are an abuser. And you can utilize and really leverage and take advantage of somebody's identity and the social disadvantages they might have because of that, because of the society we might live in, right? So, for example, under physical abuse, you might have a partner not letting a partner heal from gender affirming surgery, denying a partner access to hormones. So that might be, an abuser not letting a partner go to a healthcare professional that offers access to gender affirming hormones, or they might have the hormones, but the abuser will confiscate them or make their partner essentially earn access to the hormones. Forced PDA in dangerous anti-LGBTQ plus areas. Something, a lot of queer people, myself included, right, we're kind of constantly scanning. And there are certain areas that we might enter that definitely you kind of like pick up a vibe, right? You're like, I don't know if it's like super safe to be holding hands right now, right? So you kind of just survey the area. And this really goes to show how important power and control is to an abuser. But an abuser might still force PDA for somebody to prove their identity, right? To have their partner be fearful in that space, and essentially not allow their partner to establish a boundary, right? If you think of power and control as these little poker chips that an abuser is collecting, anytime their victim, survivor, is looking to establish a boundary, if that abuser accepts that boundary and respects that boundary, it's almost like having to give back some of those poker chips that they worked so hard to gain. So, and along those lines, right, if an abuser respects their victim's boundaries, what other boundaries are they going to be expected to respect, right? With regard to isolation, denying a partner access to LGBTQ plus community supports and events like pride parades or access to our Kaleidoscope program, for example, not letting folks essentially create community. And isolation really creates bolts on an exit door to a relationship, right? If you don't have safe people to communicate with, safe people to rely on, safe people to kind of create safety and exit plans with, it really makes it exponentially more difficult to leave a violent relationship. Outing a partner is a huge one. Even just the threat of outing a partner is really effective, right? So if an abuser knows that their partner's family, for example, is not affirming, they are just going to out them, right? And in hopes that the family cuts off their victim, right? And that creates that immediate isolation. But like I said, just the threat of outing a partner is enough to really manipulate the victim. I mean, I myself did not have affirming family, and I'm telling you right now, I would have done anything my partner asked me to prevent my family from finding out. And that's not because I enjoy deception, right? It's because I feared for my safety. And so a lot of abusers can really leverage that. Using anti-LGBTQ plus discrimination to justify an us against the world mentality. So kind of highlighting transphobic rhetoric, saying that things like nobody's going to understand your identity, but I understand your identity, or saying awful things like transness makes dating really complicated, but I show up for you, right? So kind of painting this picture that the abuser is actually the safe space and that nobody else is going to understand or be affirming. And then, of course, exploiting lack of support from friends and family as well. You have emotional abuse as well, blaming the abuse on a partner's LGBTQ plus identity. Let me be loud and clear when I say homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, all the phobias you can think of, they exist within the queer community as well. So it might sound counterintuitive if somebody comes to you and says, hey, I think my partner is being really homophobic towards me. You might be like, wait a minute, I don't understand. Aren't they also queer? It happens. And unfortunately, a lot of times it can boil down to a lot of the things that us as queer people have internalized if we're around unaffirming people or really violent people. And sometimes it gets projected onto people closest to them. So again, homophobic and transphobic behaviors absolutely still happen within queer relationships. Pressuring a partner to be out or closeted, denying that abuse can even exist in LGBTQ plus relationships, dead naming. So if you're unfamiliar with this term, a lot of trans and non-binary folks will pick a name, a new name that doesn't trigger their dysphoria. I know we talked about that last time. And so dead naming somebody is essentially calling somebody by the name they no longer go by, especially if you know that it triggers their dysphoria, can be really, really, can have some serious negative impacts. And then, of course, leveraging the institutional blind spot. So we're going to talk more about this, but some of the trainings that I provide are also to police departments and court personnel. And there is most definitely a gap in knowledge and in information. There is a really, really disturbing violent history between law enforcement, for example, and the queer community. And there really still there's still work to be done in terms of mending that relationship. And a lot of law enforcement, in my experience of providing this kind of information, aren't aware of what intimate partner violence can look like in queer relationships, aren't really aware of best practices in terms of engaging with queer and trans folks who, in an affirming way. And so an abuser can really leverage that lack of knowledge. And it's important to kind of recognize how that might play out. So just some barriers that queer victim survivors might run into, and why queer victim survivors aren't reaching out to, Mercer County's DV agency, right? Of course, and the most obvious place we can go is fear of homophobia or transphobia, especially if that individual is surrounded by unaffirming people that are supposed to really care for them. So if they're thinking to themselves, geez, if these people that are supposed to be family to me are treating me this way, how are strangers going to treat me? Or maybe they've scanned the website for a DV agency and they don't see any signal that they are accepting of LGBTQ plus individuals. They might not call because they fear being met with homophobic or transphobic language. So the other thing we can think about is lack of appropriately trained service providers. So, for example, you can think of, an instance, and a youth shared this, going to a guidance counselor and saying, hey, I'm trans, I'm in a relationship that I believe is abusive, I'm constantly dead named, so on and so forth. And the counselor kind of returns with the question of, you mentioned you were trans. What does that mean, right? And now that victim survivor is kind of forced to explain and over-explain what their identity means. And the counselor might say things like, well, are you sure they're dead naming you on purpose? Is it an accident? I could totally see how it's an accident. And now the victim survivor is forced to justify and legitimize their experience, as opposed to just coming in to a trusted individual and receiving the resources that they're looking for. The other thing is community representation. So this is consistent really among all marginalized communities. But when you're a part of a marginalized community, especially one that is consistently attacked, right, on public forums everywhere, you kind of feel this responsibility to protect the reputation of your community, right? And so if you end up, being in a relationship and your abuser just so happens to be trans or queer, you might feel hesitant to reach out and tell somebody that, yeah, my queer partner is violent, right? Because it kind of, you almost feel like you're putting fuel on the fire, right? The last thing you want to do is tear down your community, but you want help and you want to get out of this situation. And it puts you in um, a predicament, right? Because you want to protect the reputation, but you want to get out of the relationship safely. And then, of course, more about weak institutional support that I'll talk about here, especially when it comes to, law enforcement and judicial spaces as well. So there's obviously the immense misinterpretation of the dynamics of IPV and LGBTQ plus relationships. And something I'll note here is that it doesn't even just necessarily come down to a lack of knowledge of LGBTQ plus terminology and best practices, though that is definitely apparent. It also comes down to simply a lack of a nuanced understanding of what intimate partner violence is, just generally, right? So a lot of times, people will rely on this kind of gender heuristic, this kind of information shortcut. And this becomes most useful in cisgender heterosexual context. So for example, statistically, if there's a man and a woman and there's an instance of intimate partner violence, women are more likely to be the victims, men are more likely to be the perpetrators. A lot of times you rely on this information shortcut as opposed to really assessing the power dynamic there and who actually is the abuser, who actually is the victim here, as opposed to just relying on that shortcut. So we see that exacerbated when we take a look at same gender intimate partner violence, because now that gender heuristic disappears, right? There might be two women and two men, and now you have no idea what to do with that information. So for example, we can see, and one of the Department of Justice programs under the DOJ took a look at this, and what they found was dual arrests in same gender IPV cases happen 10 times more than when the female is the perpetrator and male is the victim, and 30 times more than when the female is the victim and the male is the perpetrator, right? So obviously dual arrests are happening at way higher rates, and essentially it's re-traumatizing a victim and treating them like they are a problem, right? Treating them like they are the perpetrator or they are the abuser. And we can see something similar happening with the court system, right? So judges are also more likely to issue mutual restraining orders to same-gender partners. And the California Law Review looked into this in 2020, and what they found was cases where there's a dual arrest, and then that's followed by a mutual restraining order in non-LGBTQ plus context happens maybe 1% of the time. Then when you take a look at same gender intimate partner violence context, that number jumps from 1% to 30%. So again, a misinterpretation of the dynamics of IPV generally, mixed with a lack of understanding of queer spaces and IPV in queer relationships, leads to victim survivors not getting the help they need, being re-traumatized, and being treated like a perpetrator, essentially. So with that, one of the things that we have been doing at our Pride Center is making the link between domestic violence and family rejection. And the way we've really started to take a look at this, and we've realized that there is really not a lot of research out there really naming family rejection as a form of domestic violence. And so we've kind of just started to talk about this link, because even in queer spaces, we don't really talk about it like that, right? Like we kind of just chalk it up to the fact that, my parents are super traditional, or, they follow a particular religious doctrine that doesn't allow them to believe. And we kind of just leave it at that, as opposed to naming this as, like you're experiencing abuse here in the home, and especially when we take a look at youth who are particularly vulnerable. So to kind of demonstrate this, right, I want to just walk through some stats from the Human Rights Campaign National LGBTQ plus Youth Report. And then I also want to share a little bit about my story as well to kind of continue making that link. So what they found was 40.9% of the youth respondents on this particular survey were out to all of their parents and guardians. Now, 24.8% of trans and gender expansive youth could always dress or express their gender identity at home, which means just about 75% of trans and gender expansive youth couldn't always be themselves at home, couldn't always express their gender identity in their own home, couldn't always dress the way they felt comfortable in a way that's in accordance with their gender identity. 31.5% of trans and gender expansive youth were always referred to by their affirming name, which means, again, overwhelmingly, a large majority of trans and gender expansive youth did not always have their affirming name respected in their own home. And just think about the kind of impact that might have. So, for example, we know, and this is on the same survey here, 65.5% of trans and gender expansive youth who reported their families never referred to them with correct pronouns screened positive for depression, and 72.1% of trans and gender expansive youth who report their families never refer to them with the correct name screened positive for anxiety. And there are a whole slew of negative physical and mental impacts that this has outside of this. But this is just to really think about what those impacts might look like. So I'll talk a little bit about my story as well. So this random child you see on the screen here is me. And you know it's me because we have the same very large ears. I've learned to embrace it, my friends. I have. But so I grew up part of an immigrant family. My mother immigrated from Italy, my father from Guatemala. And if you're a part of an immigrant family yourself, you might understand this, but there is a huge amount of pressure placed on you as a product of like immigrants moving to the United States to really protect the family unit, to make decisions prioritizing the family's needs and parental needs. You certainly don't tell people outside of your family about struggles you might be having or challenges you're facing. You essentially trust no one outside of the family unit, and you do as you're told, essentially. Now, obviously, there are different iterations of the intensity of that across the board, but that is to say, it was made really, really clear that being queer was not acceptable growing up. And so actually being queer and non-binary, that meant challenges, to say the least. So I'll kind of jump to why what launched me into really exploring my identity, because I didn't really have the space to do that growing up, right? Like, again, it was made abundantly clear that it was not okay. So I never really explored that. But, and this is not an uncommon experience here. It's not unique in the slightest, but my best friend and I in high school fell in love. And like I said, I'm aware this is not a unique experience, but that's what happened. And we were really best friends. Neither one of us had really ever explored our identities ever. But kind of meeting one another, we kind of started to develop feelings, and it kind of gave us this entryway into this universe that lived inside of us the whole time. Now, obviously, I was aware of the fact that this would mean trouble at home. So, when she had given me this letter to essentially confess her feelings to me, and I stuck that letter in my guitar case, thinking nobody would ever find it. And unfortunately, my mother found it, right? Like, spoiler alert, everything kind of blew up from there. So my mom finds out about this letter. She finds out about my identity. And that's where difficulties really started to set in. So something to consider here is my parents were business owners. And so they were pretty resourced. They lived in a pretty affluent neighborhood. And because they were business owners, they were connected to so many people in our neighborhood, in our town, And through that network that they've created, they also had really good connections with law enforcement, and such good connections that sometimes at Thanksgiving, like the lieutenant would come join us for pumpkin pie, right? Like they had these connections. Um, and unfortunately, the rest of my extended family shared the same sentiments, right? They were also immigrants. They had a particular mentality that they subscribed to. And it was this, super traditional mentality. And so I couldn't safely go to them either. And so what this created then was this kind of bubble of isolation, right? I essentially had nowhere to go and no one to really talk to, not only because I felt guilt if I talked about the challenges I was experiencing at home, but also because I didn't really have access to anybody outside of my home because of the isolation they created. And obviously, we could start to see the link with unaffirming family to domestic violence. When we think about, death threats, I was kicked out. We think about the verbal abuse, even the threat of physical abuse, and so you kind of create. There was a lot of fear kind of living within me for a really, really long time. Now, the reason I kind of talk about this is because the kind of investment that we make as a community in making sure that we uplift conversations around what family rejection looks like and naming it for what it is, really making an assessment of what kind of rejection we're dealing with, and what harm is really happening, and really making having a more meaningful conversation about what that rejection looks like. And therefore, talking with service providers, as a service provider, as somebody who is dedicated to service provision, making sure that we're bringing a lens to the table that is mindful of the kind of inclusivity and the kind of space that is necessary for queer people to thrive, or at the very least to survive, right? And so this is the coolest picture of me in existence. Okay, this is us at the Hatton Township Pride Parade this past June, and I think about how much an affirming workplace and an affirming community really changed my life and really saved my life. And so the stakes are high. I mean, we talk about allyship and we talk about, you know, on an individual level, can we really make an impact? The answer is yes, right? The kind of culture you create around you, the way that you speak around you, you might not know somebody around you is queer identifying, but if they hear you speak in a way that is affirming, that is kind, then they might feel inclined to come to you. They might feel inclined to just feel hope, right? And just feel joy around you. So just being aware of the impact you have as an individual moving through the world is super important. And of course, creating affirming workspaces and workplaces. So because I'm a total sap, okay, I embrace my sappiness. That best friend and I from high school are actually still together. We are engaged to be married next year. And I just say, and I use this as an opportunity, honestly, to just send a huge thank you to everybody who is invested in this work, everybody who is engaging with this kind of content, who's looking to learn more and looking to do better. And it saves lives, it changes lives. I'm living a version of my life I could have only dreamed of. And there isn't a single day where I take it for granted, not a single day. And that's why I usually just take this opportunity to, yes, I'm a hopeless romantic, yes, I'm a sap, but ultimately just to display from one individual to another, you make a difference. You have the opportunity to make an impact, to save lives. Ultimately, that's what we're looking to do, to save lives and help people grow and experience joy, experience love and healthy relationships, essentially. So with that being said, here's some resources that you can keep in your back pocket. So we work with Unity. They are the nonprofit DV agency of Mercer County. You might know them as Women's Space. So they were previously known as Women's Space. They're now going by Unity. to signal more inclusivity, which I think is awesome. We also work with Providence House. We've offered quite a few LGBTQ plus trainings there as well. So they serve Burlington County and Ocean County. So while our Pride Center does not offer direct services with regard to DV or IPV, if there's a queer individual who is really nervous about reaching out to Unity or Providence House, they can contact us and we can connect them with our contact points. So that way they feel at the very least they have advocates who are queer identifying, who are, who live in this space of being LGBTQ plus affirming. And then lastly, here is our contact page, how to connect with our team. My contact information is on the top left here. Once again, feel free to reach out to me if you're looking for any training. It's free to individuals who serve or are based in Burlington or Mercer County. So if you feel that a presentation like this would be great for your workplace, for a staff meeting, for example, or a community event that you're putting on, feel free to reach out to me. I would love to get connected with you and set something up. Carson Eckerd is our clinician. So, and this is the fun part with funding, right? It's essentially for folks in Mercer County. So if they live in Mercer County, they're under the age, they're 24 or under 24, they are able to access free clinical support from Carson. He is phenomenal. I highly recommend reaching out to him if you're looking for more information on that. And then lastly, Robin Stockton is the Associate Vice President of Community Health Initiatives. She's the big boss, all right? So she's been at the agency for a really long time. She's a wonderful, wonderful human and an amazing resource if you're looking for kind of broader questions with regard to the work that we do or questions about the agency. She's a great contact to reach out to. And then the two resources I'll share with you. Kaleidoscope is our peer-led LGBTQ plus group for teens and young adults that meet once a month in person. We also have a virtual platform as well on Discord, and that is monitored by staff. It's not a clinical space. It's not psychosocial. It's really just a space for people to kind of let their shoulders down, be who they are, meet other people in the community. And we recently just started a new group called Rainbow Roots. That is for school-aged children who have LGBTQ plus parents. So they're able to meet and connect with other LGBTQ plus families, which I think is really cool. That also meets once a month, and all of those programs are 100% free. And then lastly, we have our resource and referral hotline. So it's LGBTQ plus centric, and it is statewide. So it's not a crisis hotline, but if you're looking for any affirming resources, really in any realm, if it's education, training, healthcare, you can call the number 844-NJ-PRISM, and they will help point you in the right direction for different LGBTQ plus needs or questions that you might have. So that's it for me. You survived another hour of my rambling. Congratulations. But really, thank you so much for your time and attention. Like always, I always really appreciate the invite and the opportunity to share some information. And please feel free to reach out. Do not hesitate. I'm a talker, as you can see. So I'm always up for a good chat. And I hope that we connect in the future. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dina. That was wonderful. I hate the end of virtual programs because I always want to clap and then it's just me clapping, and it's really weird. But that was incredible and so informative. If anyone has any questions, they can throw them in the Q&A feature. But we have a couple more minutes. So one question that I would love to ask, it seems like the Center for Family Services has so many different programs and opportunities and resources. How long have they all been around? It seems like there has been a moving trend to increase awareness and more resources for intimate partner violence, period, but then also for the LGBTQ community. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit on how these resources have expanded over the years and maybe where that trend is going as we're in this current climate.
Yeah. Yeah, so Center for Family Services is actually a really old agency. It's been doing this work for over 100 years.
Wow.
Obviously, I haven't been a part of that initiative for all the 100 years. I'm still a baby in this work, but I can still respect how long this has been happening and how much this has expanded. I mean, we have over just about 100 programs
Wow.
dispersed throughout the entire state. So there's obviously an initiative here to increase this kind of work. The Pride Center itself, I can speak on the expansion there, really expanded in 2023, and that was through a merger. So I actually come from an organization called Life Ties that merged with Center for Family Services, and that's where the Pride Center was born. So there was always kind of this desire to build out a Pride program on behalf of Center for Family Services, but kind of linking with other community resources, other organizations that might be looking to merge or kind of work collectively has kind of allowed this kind of work to explode essentially. Um, the work is not done. And obviously, the goal is always to expand, whether that be expanding our programs or simply collaborating with other programs. It seems as though the commitment is still absolutely to serve everybody and to ensure everybody feels included, feels that our motto has been everyone belongs. So we've all got little orange stickers on our laptops and in our cubicles that say everyone belongs. But that initiative is only becoming stronger and only growing truly. So
Awesome. That's so beautiful. Yeah. Especially in New Jersey, I know um, there's been a mix of responses to different initiatives like this. I think us being kind of blue, but then things are shifty within that. Right now, this current moment can be a funding crisis for a lot of people, and a morale crisis for a lot of people. And so on that latter note, I'm wondering like how you and your staff take care of each other, doing this really important work. I know like people don't normally talk about that, but I think it's really important
yeah,
when we do these kinds of trainings of like, well, how do you feel?
yeah.
How do you maintain that
No,
feeling?
totally, totally. And I'll share too, a lot of times, because I absolutely love providing training and education, but I think it would absolutely take more of a toll on me, especially if I'm presenting in spaces where they're kind of mandated to be in the room and they don't want to hear the information. Maybe they don't agree with what I'm sharing. That would definitely take a toll, a much harder toll on me had I not have, amazing colleagues to be able to turn to and say, hey, like, how would you handle the situation? Or just to feel like we're surrounded by people that really understand, that really share the same investment in this kind of work that we do. But a lot of times, honestly, that just looks like going to the conference room and like, one of those days,
Mhm.
one of those days, and kind of just like being with one another, surrounding yourself with people that really build you up, that understand your frustration with the world sometimes. It's important to stay positive and keep each other upbeat, but sometimes you kind of have to like sink into the reality a little bit. And sometimes it's important to feel the frustration and kind of just sit there a little bit. And I think as a team, and I've mentioned this, we're a really small team. But we're there for each other and kind of building solidarity kind of keeps us going. Where one of us is down, the other one is like, it's all right, buddy. I got your back today. I got your back. So no, but self-care is definitely important, especially in this work, because it can feel really draining sometimes, but having the right group of people around you to energize you is absolutely critical in sustaining this work.
Well, that's so beautiful. I think that's like a beautiful note to close on. I know Gina, we were talking a lot about like how to keep going during this time,
Yeah.
how troubling everything feels, but how important community is now more than ever, as we propel ourselves forward. I
Yeah.
want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. This edition of Champions of Equality, along with the first edition with Dina, well, the first one is on our YouTube. This one will be on our YouTube tomorrow morning, and you can go watch and share and send to your colleagues and your friends. Our next Champions of Equality is going to be in September. But before that, we have a really exciting event that I'm sure if you follow us on Instagram, you've seen us post a lot about. But on August 23rd, from 12 to 4 p.m., we are going to have our fourth annual Women's Equality Day Festival. We're going to have women-owned craft fairs, a gay puppet show, women rock stars rocking out on the porch, and free tours. So you will not want to miss this. It's going to be really, really fun. On September 19th, we are going to be doing our first ever Women's History Trivia Night at the museum. It's going to be 21 plus, so your ticket will cover a free tour, trivia, and 2 beers. And if you know your history, you will be rewarded. And that's all I will say. It's going to be really fun. But
Sounds
yeah, we have a lot
awesome.
of really exciting stuff coming up in the fall. Make sure to follow us on Instagram at Alice Paul Center and you know, keep doing all the important work that you're doing. Showing up is really important. Everyone who showed up today is doing really impactful, important feminist advocacy, whether they realize it or not. All of the information that you learned tonight will be on YouTube, but you can go tell your friends about it. That's how to be a good advocate, right? We learn and then we tell our friends. And I know everyone here is going to be really good at doing that. I believe in them. So I want everyone in your homes to virtually give Dina a round of applause. Make sure you check out the Center for Family Services and keep your eyes peeled on your inbox tomorrow, where I'll send you all of the resources that Dina shared so you can share it with your network. But thank you all so much for being here and have a beautiful rest of your night.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.